the minute. So if I've got Twitch on my phone in front of me. So if the connection goes or you can't hear me, just drop a message in the chat and I'll try and figure something out. So today I'm going to talk to you briefly about a topic that's pretty close to my heart, and that is learning. You know, in our industry, things move so quickly, things are changing all the time, that learning is a really important skill. Now, this talk has teach in the title, right? Learning by teaching. What does that mean? Well, I promise you that by the end of this session, you'll understand how teaching the things you know can also help you learn. And to do that, we're going to understand more about what it means to be a solutions architect, what that means for your brand. Like, what an awesome session we've just had with Niraja about brand, and then some practical tools that you can use to actually start to build your brand in the technical industry. So for anyone who's heard me speak about anything ever, I always like to start with why. I think it's really important to understand the why before you try and get into the what and the how. And as Niraja was saying, you know, understanding the why of your brand is really important. Where do you want to go? Where do you want to see? How do you want to be seen in the world? Because if you're active on social media, you're active online, you're active in a community, you have a brand of some kind, whether conscious or unconscious. So we're going to go a little bit off topic briefly, and then we'll come back to the teaching part at the end, I promise. And I want to start with a quick story about the process I went through to start producing the content that I produce. So some of you may know, some of you might not, that I produce content on YouTube. So I wanted to start producing content and teaching people for years, but I was absolutely terrified of doing that because I was scared, right? I was scared of, is it going to be up to the standards, both my own standards? Am I good enough to be able to teach people? Do I have the knowledge to be able to teach people? That massive imposter syndrome. And I'm sure some people listening, whether you're new to tech, whether you've been in tech for years, you probably have a similar feeling in some part of your career. Like, what do I have to teach? That is exactly what I was feeling. So I went through a process. I looked at what it actually means to be a solutions architect, how that aligns with my strengths. You know, Niraja again talked about what are your strengths, and then use that to look at what the content was that I wanted to produce. So let's start by unpacking this a little bit. So solutions architect, what does that actually mean? What skills does a solutions architect need? Well, let's look at some definitions first. The solutions part is the means of solving a problem or dealing with a difficult situation. That's a solution. The architect, there's two definitions for architect if you Google this. One being the more traditional architect, someone who's designing buildings to plan and supervise their construction. And the other definition being our industry, someone who designs hardware, software, applications, etc. Now, I think in our industry, this term is actually a little bit misleading. And let me explain why. So if we think about architects in the construction world, the architect is someone who designs the buildings, right? They plan and they supervise. So you've got the architect here designing and planning and supervising. Now, if this was the construction industry, you'd also have probably an engineer of some kind. The architect might create a design, and then the engineer might understand the structural load, how things can fit together, how much weight a certain thing can hold. And then you'd also have someone else. You'd have the builders. You'd have the people actually on the ground, actually building these things and putting these things together. So I went through this process and I was thinking about this, and I was like, well, actually, that doesn't really work in the tech industry, because to be a good architect in the tech industry, you kind of need to be all of them things. You kind of need to be a solutions architect, engineer, builder. And that is a bit of a mouthful to put on a job title, right? But when I was going through this process and I was thinking about what is the content that I want to produce, you know, I'm interested in architecture and solutions architecture, but is it enough just to be talking about design? We need to be able to build things. We need to understand the load of things. Actually, the definition I prefer is just problem solver. That's all we are. We're problem solvers. And then if you put that lens on the content, the building a brand side of things, okay, what skills do you have that can help other people solve problems? I'm a massive believer that all of us have something that someone else can learn from. All of us can help someone else solve a problem, technical or otherwise. So I landed on this definition. I was like, okay, so we're problem solvers, right? That's what we are in our industry. So what content can I look at to help people solve problems? And while I was doing that, I stumbled across one of the most fantastic YouTube videos I've ever seen about our industry. And it's this YouTube video, and I'll pop this link in the Twitch chat once I'm done talking. It's a talk from Gregor Hope, who works at AWS. And it's a talk about what he calls the architect's elevator. And he's actually wrote a book about this, as Gregor. It's a really awesome book. It's behind me somewhere next to the alcohol. Sheesh. And what Gregor talks about in the architect's elevator is the different levels that a solutions architect or any kind of architect needs to operate at. So if you imagine the typical skyscraper, the typical hierarchical structure in a business, you've got the CTO sat somewhere up near the top of this building, and then you've got, the intern engineer probably sat somewhere much lower down. Now, as an architect, you need to be able to ride this elevator up and down. It's not enough to just be able to think at the high level and not be able to build, and similarly, just being able to build and not think at the high level. They're very different skills. Niraj mentioned again about being a Java developer, but what are your other strengths and how can they be applied? The Java developer is a really useful skill at the kind of building level of architecture. But actually, maybe you're listening to this and you're really excellent at talking to people, dealing with people. Okay, well, then you can start to ride that elevator up and down. And some architects will be better at one end of the spectrum than the other. But what would you like to be known for? What is it about your brand or the way you like to be seen? How would you want to be known? I very consciously at this point decided that I want to be more towards the technical level. How can I help people solve technical problems? Like the business strategy stuff is interesting, but it's the technical stuff I find really, really interesting. So then I thought, okay, so we've got this elevator, we're riding the elevator up and down. I've decided I want to focus more at the technical level, and I'm a problem solver. The content I want to produce is solving problems. So what problems do people need to solve in our industry? What technical problems? And the simple place I ended up was here. We're all familiar with these things, I'm sure by now. We had awesome guests on last week talking about certifications, and we're all familiar with them. And certifications are great. They give you practical advice about specific AWS services, and getting all of the certs it's an aspirational goal. If you like taking exams, things like these are really great for CVs and resumes and starting to build that brand of having a certain level of knowledge. But I actually think there's a slight problem with this line of thinking, at least in my opinion, and with certifications in general, because certifications teach you very specific things about very specific AWS services. And a lot of these services are sat around in a vacuum. That you're taught about EC2, and then you're taught about developer, and then you're taught about DynamoDB and all of these things. But actually, the problems we solve as technologists span all these different spectrums. These are really, really hard, nuanced problems that are going to be specific to each customer that you might talk to. So understanding the theory of a specific AWS certification, I could produce content to teach people about AWS certifications, and part of me being involved in BISA and doing this awesome work is that exact reason, because certifications are great to demonstrate that knowledge. But actually, once you get into industry and start dealing with the specific nuanced problems of each individual customer, you quickly realize that the technical stuff is kind of easy. It's this that is the problem. It's almost always a people problem. Understanding the different requirements people have, asking the right questions, solving the problems before you even get into the implementation details. And then once you get into the implementation details, you might need to teach somebody how to build it. As an architect, you may not be building every solution yourself. So what we're doing as architects, we're taking complex things and we're making them simple, both business requirements and technical requirements. That's what we're doing. So coming back around to that AWS certifications, I could pass an AWS certification, I could read books, I could, remember what the right answer is to each individual question. But until you've built a Lambda function that reads from S3 and then gets stuck in an infinite loop because you're right back to the S3 bucket and that triggers your Lambda function again. And yes, I've done that and it cost a reasonable amount of money until I noticed. Until you've actually been hands-on and actually built things, it's really difficult to give that really accurate knowledge that meets a specific customer's problem. There's this term in the industry called the ivory tower architect. And the ivory tower architect is someone who just sits, designs systems, mandates that teams use certain products and certain services, but they aren't actually on the ground building software. They aren't in the engine room, as Gregor would say, in the architect's elevator. And the best architects I've worked with are the ones who can take these high-level business requirements and follow them right through to writing individual lines of code. Now, that was a lot of theory, and now you're all sat there thinking, this was supposed to be about teaching and learning. What the heck is James talking about? Well, what I've tried to give there is just an overview of how I landed on the kind of content I produce. I work through what I think some of the challenges are in the industry, why I think they're challenging, and ended up with the content I try and produce that is very technical focused and to make what are typically complex technical problems to try and make them simpler. And I'll get into some ways I try and do that. But how does this relate to teaching, right? How does learning relate to teaching? Well, there's a really famous physicist called Richard Feynman, and he has some brilliant theories on learning. One of his most famous quotes, in fact, is, if you want to master something, teach it. I'd really recommend following him on Twitter, actually, if you use Twitter, because he's put some really good stuff on there. But to teach, what Richard's saying here is to teach someone something else, maybe something really complex, in a simple way, that means that you yourself need to have a really deep understanding of how the thing works to be able to teach it, right? That's before people even start asking questions, just to be able to explain something simply. Like, it's quite difficult unless you know it in detail. And he actually has a technique for learning things as well. So you pick a topic that you might want to understand. Let's say that is advanced networking, because I know very little about networking. Let's say that's advanced networking. And I'll study it for a little bit. I'll do some initial research, and then I'll pretend to teach it. I might build a session that is something I might give at BISA. I might give on here. And then I'd teach it, and I'd look at where I started to stumble as I was trying to teach it. And then I'd go back where I got stuck, and I'd come back and I'd teach it again. I'd simplify. And we have the master of analogies here with us, luckily. Try and use analogies to help explain some of these complex topics. So the thing here is, if you really want to understand something deeply, teaching it is a really fantastic way of doing that. And we're really lucky, I think, in our industry, because we've got lots of different ways of teaching. Teaching doesn't necessarily need to be what we do at BISA, where we're stood talking to you all. There's lots of different ways that you can teach. So let's have a look at some practical things now that you can look at to help building your brand and teaching and improving your learning. And the first is one that I'm sure most of us are pretty familiar with now, and that is GitHub. GitHub is an excellent tool for improving your learning and teaching others. Learning in public is a really great skill, and that's for a few reasons, right? It demonstrates to potential employers that you're an active practitioner of the technology that you're talking about. Now, I'm not suggesting that having an active or inactive GitHub profile might stop you getting a job, but being active on GitHub is a really great thing to be able to show that, you know, you're actually building these things, you're actually working, you're actually doing these things. And it really allows you to upskill and get into the engine room. You know, if you're publishing things publicly, you're doing the work. And also a well-written README in a GitHub repository actually gets indexed by Google. So you can then actually potentially help somebody stuck with the same problem that you've solved in your GitHub repository. So if you have a quick look at my GitHub repository now, for example, so these are all the public repositories on my GitHub, and everything I do when I'm learning a new topic, I'll always do that publicly. So for example, over the last couple of months, I've been teaching myself the Rust programming language. So I've got a repository here, Rust on serverless, learning Rust in public. Now, the Rust code in this repository is probably not great, but having it out publicly and learning in public demonstrates that at least level of knowledge. I've got, I was working with App Runner, starting to use AWS App Runner all in public, modernizing .NET applications, just playing around with that, trying to build event-driven systems without any lines of code. You know, everything I do publicly. Learning, I don't know why I wanted to do this, but I did for a little while, tried to learn Kubernetes, you know, so everything I try and do in public. And then in each of these repositories, I try and write content that will make this easy to understand if someone comes across this repository, easy for them to deploy it, but also think about that angle of, okay, someone's looking how to do translation with AWS serverless technologies. Maybe they end up on this GitHub repository. Maybe that's valuable to them. So GitHub is a really, really awesome way to do this. And when I was building out these Rust examples, I set myself the challenge to write some Rust code every single day for about 3 weeks. And that some days that was like 15 minutes of writing code. And all of it every day was published to GitHub. And that massively helped my learning, because I was thinking about, okay, this is going to go public. I need to understand this well. I might potentially create some YouTube videos on this. And actually, that's what I ended up doing. I ended up creating some YouTube videos on the Rust content as well. And I wouldn't have been able to do that without going through the process and doing this learning with that lens of, I'm going to teach this at some point. So that's GitHub. That's one option. And that's a really easy way to get started teaching your content, teaching anything you learn without needing to write or get in front of a camera or things like that. But the next one is being recorded, video content. So like I said at the start, I produce videos on YouTube. I do things like Bisa. And again, it's amazing to live in a time where it's so easy to produce content and publish it. You know, to set up a YouTube account, start publishing content there is so easy. And I'll show you some tools in a second that I use to make it even easier. Now, since I started producing content on YouTube, I don't think I can even explain how much deeper my technical knowledge has got in certain areas, like the internals of how serverless technologies work, the .NET programming language, the Rust programming language, you know, doing things with this lens of, I'm going to have to teach this to people, really, really helps drive home that focus on understanding and really, really understanding something well. And it doesn't need to be a long process. You know, if video is something you're interested in, YouTube is something you're interested in. Like, I consciously produce videos that are typically between 10 and 15 minutes long, because, I mean, frankly, I don't have a lot of spare time, and I respect that people watching are probably equally as busy and probably also have very little spare time. So do people want to sit down and watch a 1 hour, 10, 15, 20 minute long video? Probably not. And I'm also compressing that time frame, trying to work to 10-minute videos, again, really helps drive home that understanding, because then I need to understand the absolute necessary information needed to be able to teach this to somebody and get that across in a simple way. Like, I don't have time in 10 minutes to explain the deep technical internals of how Lambda works, but what is the absolute necessary information needed to understand how Lambda works. So producing videos, some technical tools for producing videos. So producing videos is, I can't believe I put it off for so long because the process is so easy, and I am not a creative person at all. Like, my brother's a graphic designer and he laughs at how bad I am at like creative graphics design, video editing type things. I'm really, really bad at it. But it's a super easy process. So one of the tools I use is called OBS Studio. OBS Studio is super easy to use. It's completely free, and you download it, you install it, you set up your devices. So you see here, I've got video capture and display capture. So I'm capturing both the display and my video. The video is not showing because it's using on beta at the minute. But there's other things you can add. You can change the color. You can add different scenes and do scene transitions. You can do all sorts of crazy things. And then you just hit start recording over on the right hand side. I realize this might be a little bit small and I can't really zoom the OBS window, sorry. But there's all these buttons over on the right hand side here. I hit start recording, off I go, I record. And typically when I'm recording, I'll record my videos in chunks. So, let's say I'm doing something about deploying Lambda functions. I might record the first bit, hit the deploy button, and then stop the recording, wait for the deployment to finish, and then start the recording again. So then what I end up with is all these chunks of video footage. And sometimes that can be 15, 16, 17 video clips even, depending on what the process is. And I used to really manually edit all these video clips together. And like I said, I am not a creative person at all. I am really quite bad at that kind of things. And actually, I got recommended another tool, which, if video content is something of interest to you, is one of the most game-changing tools I think I've ever used. And it's a tool called Descript. So what Descript allows you to do is load your video files into the software. And I can't see my other screen just for a minute. So you load all of your video files into the software. And what Descript does is it transcribes your video footage. And then you can actually edit your video by editing the script. So if I was to delete some of the words in here, Descript would automatically cut the video on my behalf and get rid of the words. I can also automatically remove any filler words, so any ums, ahs, ers, and I can also shorten word gaps. So if I've got a 2 or 3 second piece of white space of no talking, Descript can just remove all of that for you. And this is massively, like, the editing process used to take me between half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour sometimes. Descript, it's maybe a 10-minute process. Like, the barrier to entry with something like Descript is so incredibly low. It's really, really easy to get started producing video content. So they're the two tools I use, and that's my entire video production workflow. Think of the ideas beforehand. Typically, I have about 2 or 3 videos in the bank, if you will, just waiting to be published, to allow myself to think about things and, what do I want to produce yet? I do polls on Twitter and LinkedIn to work out what content I want to produce next and what people are interested in learning about. So that's video production, nice and easy. But of course, we're not all comfortable in front of a camera. Like, this isn't something that comes naturally to a lot of people. So what other options are there? Well, there's writing. There's plenty of websites out there that make it really easy to get started writing blogs. The simplest of tools that isn't even on here is LinkedIn. Can you just start posting things on LinkedIn? And I know some of you listening do regularly do that. I see many of you posting things on LinkedIn, and it's awesome that you're sharing your knowledge and doing that. So we've got dev.to, we've got Medium, we've got WordPress. There's a bunch of different tools that you can use for blogging. I actually run my blog from a GitHub repository. So if I go back to my GitHub repositories, I've got a private repository in here somewhere. If I just switch that over to private, I've got a private repository. The reason my blog's private here is because I have draft posts and things like that in my GitHub. I use a tool called WowChamey. I can put all these links in the Twitch chat once I'm done. And what WowChamey allows you to do is actually write content in Markdown. So if I go into some of my posts here, Let's have a look at software design, importance of patterns. So I actually write my blog posts in, if I switch that over to there, I actually write my blog posts in Markdown in a GitHub repository. And I just commit changes to Git to publish a new blog post. So you see, this is all Markdown. So this is familiar to my technical developer-y brain. I'm just writing in Markdown. And then off the back of that, I use Netlify. So there's a tool called a hosting company called Netlify, and Netlify allows you to connect a website to a GitHub repository, and then from there, there's an automated build pipeline that runs in Netlify. That every time I commit a change to the main branch of my GitHub repository, that triggers a CI/CD pipeline which regenerates my blog and publishes it to look something like this. I've not written a single line of CSS. Remember, I'm terrible at creative stuff. So I've not written a single line of CSS, of HTML, of any of that. All I do is write content in Markdown, wherever that Markdown's just gone. I write code in Markdown, commit that to the main branch, and this is what comes out the other end of the pipe. Once I've got the blog here, then I repost that to things like Dev2 and Medium, just to kind of get a bit more reach for the content, really. So that's my writing workflow. And there's even easier ways to get started than that. Like I said, just publishing on Dev2 or Medium or LinkedIn. All these things make it really easy to get started teaching the things that you're learning. So my final note before I stop talking and we get on to our next awesome guest is think about a lot of what Niraj saying was really important. You know, what is it that you want to be seen for or known for? Whether you are conscious or unconscious about that at the minute, there will be that brand being built around you. And think about what it actually means to be an architect and what you actually want your career to be in the future. You know, again, Niraj has talked about intentional careers. Maybe you want to sway more towards the top end of this elevator. The idea of like strategy, business strategy, and how technical strategy can go forward in the future. And then things like microservices architecture might become really interesting in cloud native architecture. Or maybe you'd prefer to be down in the weeds at the other end of the elevator where I like to sit. And then your content becomes around how can people solve technical problems with the content they produce. And the final thing I will say, Niraj said this, Ashish also alluded towards this, is one thing I found producing content is that consistency is absolutely key. Consistency to keep yourself learning, you know, to tech moves so fast. So consistency with yourself to keep learning, and teaching is a really good mechanism to help you do that, but also consistency for your audience. Consistency is key. Thanks for this. If there's any questions, pop them in the chat. I will grab all of the links I've just talked about and pop them in the Twitch chat as well. But yeah, thank you.
That was interesting, James. Yeah, I completely agree on what you said. Like, consistency is the key, the last thing, and then sharing knowledge obviously helps you also learn a lot, because sometimes you do not know what you do not know unless somebody asks you something, right? So if somebody asks you a question, you start digging into, hey, how this happens, or what component we can use, what we can do to solve this complex logic. So yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, learn by teaching. So maybe you want to just publish a blog, maybe you want to just do something, maybe a YouTube video, and maybe keep it private if you don't want to make it public in case, or maybe anything. Means there are so many mediums, and as you said, it is so easy now. It's not like it's very complicated to create content. It takes time, that's all. But yeah, but the tools are there, and the list which James shared is really useful tools. So we'll put them into resources section, and
Yeah.
probably you would be also able to get help of that. And James, would you mind putting your YouTube and GitHub links here? So
Yeah.
we can like we can give it onto resource page, and everyone can then look at those resource page. So good, thank you for that.
Yeah. I think that what something you said there that I'll just pick up on, Ashish. You know, that Richard Feynman tool for learning that, learn about a topic, pretend to teach it, and then go back and look at your gap. Like doing that privately is absolutely awesome. Like I do that with, if I grab my notebook, just a second, like all of this stuff here is me doing
Yeah.
exactly that. Think about a topic. Okay, how would I teach this topic? Okay, I don't know about how border gateway protocol works in networking. I'm not going to share this with everybody because my networking knowledge is terrible. But doing that, applying that process and pretending to teach is really, honest, such a valuable tool.
Yeah. So we have a question, James. It's a little long-winded, but yeah, means it's an interesting question. So if you could read it. So I started some of my blogging months ago, not completed yet. I got burdened and overwhelmed by my goal of achieving too much in that
Yeah.
blog. Not completed. How to overcome it? Yeah, time is
It's,
always limited, isn't it?
yeah, it's really interesting you said that, actually, Pawan, because one of the reasons I didn't produce content for a while was, I want to have so many followers or so many views or so many subscribers or anything like that. And I think, at least for me personally, setting that goal of I want to do this with my YouTube channel, I want to have this many subscribers or this many views. I tried to like completely reframe how I looked at my content. So as opposed to looking at my content as I want to get this many views, I want to get this many subscribers. Of course, I want to teach people, but using it as a tool for my own learning was a slight reframe that I put on it. So like I was talking about, I want to learn about a topic more. I know if I need to teach that topic, I'll learn it really well. So use my YouTube channel as a way to teach myself about stuff.
Exactly.
That then has the ramifications of actually impacting other people in the long run. So maybe it's just a slight reframe plan. Like maybe it's, okay, I'm going to use my blog to just document the things that I'm learning and help me work through my own thinking about a problem. Like some of the blog posts I've written, it's where I've just been writing, thinking about something, writing it down, thinking about something, writing it down, and then publishing it. It's just clarifying my own thoughts. And then maybe that does get 1 million subscribers. I hope it does for you, Pawan. I hope it does get, if it becomes a really popular blog. But maybe you impact one person. That's awesome too, because you've helped somebody else in the world. Like, and I don't know if that's what you mean by achieving too much, but I think the internet has made it so easy to see influencers who've got millions of followers and millions of subscribers. When actually impact one person, impact two people. Amazing. You've done a fantastic job. So that's the kind of reframe I try to put on my content, at least.
Yeah. That should be the byproduct, I guess. So the intent should be knowledge sharing, and if you get something as a byproduct, yeah, well and good. Why not? We
Absolutely.
started Besa with the same intention. We were
Yeah.
hoping for only 20 people to join minimum. What all? It means even for our behavioral track, we had idea like even if we get 10 people or even one person selected in AWS, that would be success of our program. So yeah, that makes sense. Completely makes sense. And I like to like have a quote from Ranga here. I like that. Chocos and apple divide when you share. Knowledge is the only stuff that actually
I love that.
multiplies when you share.
That's
Exactly.
amazing.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
an
but
amazing quote.
yeah, I would be happy to share my knowledge, but not my apple. So
Yeah,
that's
absolutely. That's an
all right.
amazing quote. Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome.
Nice. Thank you. All right. Abhijit is here too. Hey, Abhijit, want to say just hi? Means been long, haven't seen you on the screen. And yeah, and now we have our next guest with us, who is Victory. Victory is a solution architect, and obviously, I would let her talk about it. But I want to check a pulse of audience. Are you okay to continue? Means I'm okay. So if we can keep moving forward without a break, I'm okay with that. But if you feel, a lot of you, that hey, we should take a short break and then come back, I'm okay with that too. So whatever you tell me in the chat, we would go with that. If you want to go forward, let's move forward. Yeah, that would be much better. Yeah, you are okay. Thank you. Pawan is okay too. Ranga is fine. Nivedita is fine. All right, good. Thank you. So thanks, James. And we will wait for the links, and I'll put it into resources section, and we will hope to see you into some other sessions too. Thank you. All right, Victory. I'm going to add you onto the chat now, onto the screen, and